to the presentation. Today I'm going to be discussing an analysis I was able to do regarding the relationship between empathy and social function in patients with schizophrenia. Now, to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be talking about, I'm going to introduce who I am so you can get context for this whole presentation. Then we're going to discuss the literature on the subject before diving into the design of the analysis, what that analysis found, and anything we can draw from those findings. But like I said, who am I? Well, my name is Eric Gasset. I go to UMass Boston. I plan on graduating this May of 2021. I will be graduating with a BS in psychology, and I am a pre-med student intending on becoming a psychiatrist after all this is over. This research experience was not afforded to me through UMass Boston. This was afforded to me through Mass General Hospital. I work in a psychiatric lab underneath Dr. Daphne Holt, who is doing her own research on schizophrenia and social situations. There was a plethora of data available, and none of it was being used for this purpose. I thought this was an incredibly interesting subject and also something that is potentially incredibly important. So I was given permission to run with the data, and run I did. But before we discuss what I did, what do we already know? What do we know about empathy, social function, and schizophrenia? Well, we know that schizophrenia is a chronic disorder that is comprised of positive and negative symptoms that ultimately affects those diagnosed in a variety of manners within their entire life. One of the foremost ways that it affects those individuals is within their social function and their social well-being. We know that individuals who are diagnosed with SSD, schizophrenia spectrum disorder, are far more likely to be very lonely compared to their control counterparts. And we also know that negative symptomology and positive symptomology can affect them in very different ways, with negative symptoms often showing less social contacts within their social networks. And we also know that there are more dysfunctional relationships within these individuals who are diagnosed. We know that all of this culminates in an increase in social isolation, which leads to suicide being the #1 cause of death within these populations. It's an extremely unfortunate situation and ultimately deserves far more attention. But where does empathy come in? How does empathy relate to social function? Well, we know that empathy is a social skill that most every human uses to relate to other individuals and improve their relationships. And we know that neurologically speaking, empathy is regulated through top-down and bottom-up processing. Bottom-up being more automatic, top-down being more cognitive. And we know that there are some major players within the anatomy of these systems, but the #1 I want to speak on is the anterior cingulate cortex, which plays a massive role in bottom-up processing. In schizophrenia, we see that this area is severely impaired, both structurally, electrically, and neurochemically. All these impairments ultimately culminate in seeing a massive impairment in empathy itself within the schizophrenic population. So it stands to reason that a social skill being impaired may affect the overall social function of the individual. My analysis intended to see how important empathy is in influencing these social systems. And I came up with a number of hypotheses to analyze exactly how this may play out. I invite you to pause the video and read through these if you want. Regarding things like perspective taking, empathetic concern, ECPT, fantasy, and personal distress are what I referenced in part 3 of my hypotheses here. Those are regarding the 4-factor model of conceptualizing empathy, where empathy is divided into 4 factors: empathetic concern, perspective taking, fantasy, and personal distress. These all ultimately are used to score someone's ability to be empathetic with others. Now, going into the design and what I did, I was able to extract quite a lot of data, and this is the participant breakdown of that. I also invite you to pause here to take a deeper look at this. But the key takeaways for this is racially, age-wise, and gender-wise, we see far more white people involved in this study. We see far more young people involved in the study, and we also see far more males involved in this study. These are often associated with being the highest risk populations for individuals who are diagnosed with SSD. And so it only made sense that when recruiting people for this study, for Dr. Daphne Holt's study, they were comprising or representing these certain identities. And then in terms of the measures that we used in this analysis, empathy, social context, loneliness, and time spent with others were all characterized with their own measures. These are all universally used psychoanalytic measures with the exception of the time alone questionnaire. The time alone questionnaire is very straightforward. It simply asks how much time you spend with others and how much time you would like to spend with others. And this was developed by Dr. Daphne Holt in her own lab. Now, what did we find? Well, we found that between all groups, empathetic concern was different, with patients being the most impaired compared to their relatives and their controls. Now, this is particularly significant, partially because most other studies don't examine the relative component of this. So we see that relatives are more closely related regarding empathetic concern to controls than the patient population is. But we also see, according to the literature, so this is reconfirming, that patients do experience the most impaired empathetic concern between all of the groups. Moving on, we see a few interesting results. First, we see that being in school, which is a demographic result, ultimately was positively correlated with empathetic ability, the total empathetic capacity, not just one of the aspects. This suggests to us that being in a social setting or being forced to be in a social setting with others helps to practice your empathetic abilities regardless of whether or not the individual wants to, and can improve their empathetic capacity. The key relationships that we found in a correlational analysis, breaking down empathy into its four-factor model, found that empathetic concern was a very strong predictor of all things regarding social networks. So we see, if you take a look at the chart, the empathetic concern was strong and positively correlated with the size of the social network of the individual, the number of contacts outside of work and family that that individual had, and the number of embedded networks. Embedded networks being networks that this individual is actively choosing to participate in on a regular basis. We see that the total empathetic ability and perspective taking within the patient population is also significantly related to the size of the social network. But we really only see that personal distress is related to control interactions with loneliness, the hours time spent with people, and the number of embedded networks, which suggests that empathy is uniquely distorted within the patient population such that personal distress doesn't affect them in that particular way. And then finally, we wanted to construct a predictive measure for this. So we used a multiple linear regression across all facets of empathy with the network size of the individual. And we found that, much like the correlations, empathetic concern was the greatest positive predictor of an individual's network size in the patient population, with perspective taking being the second greatest positive predictor. The total empathetic capacity, or the total IRI, as well as the patient group itself, just being in the patient group, was negatively predicting network size. So these are very interesting results that effectively tell us that empathetic concern and perspective taking as facets of empathy itself are incredibly strong in being able to predict someone's network size and influencing it ultimately. While, and this is something we already know, the patient group aspect of this is something that does negatively predict having a large patient group. The total empathetic capacity was very interesting because that suggests to us that that empathy as a whole within patients is impaired enough to predict a smaller network size, something that was hypothesized and something that was talked about in the literature. But what can we draw from all this? Why is it significant? Well, just like I talked about in the results section, we saw that patients have a reduced empathetic capacity compared to their relatives and controls. This is something that was already known, but something that we were able to reaffirm once again within the study. But we also know that social environments are very capable of producing a higher capacity and a higher ability for empathetic relationships, or fostering empathetic relationships in all populations, controls, relatives, and patients, which is significant. And we know that aspects of empathetic ability are sufficient in influencing aspects of social function. This is where empathetic concern comes in once again. If you take a look back to when I was talking about empathetic concern repeatedly, this is to say that empathetic concern itself could be strong enough to influence an individual's social function enough to improve it if it were to be improved itself, that being empathetic concern. Why does this matter? Well, Functionally, we could take this knowledge and we could implement it into creating or into the creation of new interventions for schizophrenia spectrum disorder treatments. We know that empathetic classes exist. There are examples of individuals, therapists, counselors, psychiatrists, using classes that teach empathy as a treatment for certain individuals. This isn't widely utilized throughout the schizophrenic population, but if it were to be added on to the general course of treatment, it could ultimately see improvements in the social well-being of these individuals, and we can see decreases in loneliness within these populations. We can see decreases in the number of suicides per year in these populations. We can see improvements in the quality of relationships that these individuals are having, which all ultimately can only be assumed to improve the overall well-being of a person who is diagnosed with schizophrenia spectrum disorder. Now, I've listed my references here, but I also listed my contact information. Please feel free to use this. I have my social media, email, and phone number available. If you would like to talk and if you would like to ask any questions regarding what we found, please feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about this. I will hopefully be publishing a paper soon on the subject, but I want to thank you so much for watching this video. I want to thank you for coming to MassURC, and I want to wish you well and hope that you enjoy all the rest of the presentations that are available at MassURC. Once again, thank you.